why am I sharing this image with you today? What do you think this might be? Is it maybe a microscopic view of some newly discovered virus, or maybe it's part of the latest exhibit at the Institute of Contemporary Art? Actually, this is a deeply personal image. It was created by a woman in her 60s who was challenged with bipolar disorder. And she explained in a therapeutic group that this image expresses what she feels in her mind when she has manic cycles. And she said she couldn't wait to share this image with her son. She said, he knows about my illness, but I don't think he really understands what it is I experience. So it turns out this image began as a photograph on an iPhone. And this is what that photograph looked like. It was a crumpled mass of phone cords. Phone cords that she turned into a very personal story. This image was created by a woman in a community workshop focused on the theme of resilience. And she explained that this image reflected a personal transformation that she was going through in life. Turns out, this image also began as a photograph on an iPhone, and here's what it looked like. It was her lunch that day, a pretty tasty looking sandwich. A sandwich that became a very expressive statement. So these images were both created by people with no particular artistic skills or training, and they were both done using a specialized mobile app that just takes minutes to learn and enables a level of expression and connection that's often just not possible with the spoken word alone. We call this Expressive Digital Imagery, or EDI. And EDI is a new technique that enables professional clinicians and therapists and social workers to help people who are facing life's challenges, whether it's addiction or homelessness or cancer or mental illness. And in fact, EDI is currently being used at some of the leading institutions in the country, including McLean Hospital and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And today, I'd like to bring EDI to life for you by sharing imagery and the stories behind it. But you may be wondering who I am and why I'm here speaking with you about this today. I spent 20 years as a business consultant with a large consulting company, and then another 10 years as a volunteer consultant in the community, helping nonprofit organizations. It was a great run, and it was something I could have done indefinitely. But two things happened in my life that changed all that. The first was I took up photography. Really as a hobby to start with. I'd never done anything artistic in my entire life. But I quickly became very passionate about my photography, much of which happens on Cape Cod. It's a place I cherish because it's home to many of my family's most special memories. The second thing that happened involved my family. When we experienced medical challenges that were difficult and unexpected. And about 2 years ago, as I was reflecting back on what had helped me cope through some of those hardest times, I began to realize that my imagery had played a therapeutic role that I never could have expected. And it got me thinking about the idea of enabling anyone, regardless of whether they had any artistic training or photographic equipment, to create their own therapeutic imagery right on mobile devices that we have with us all the time. So I started speaking with people in hospitals and clinics and schools and shelters to see who might be willing to give this idea a chance. And before I knew it, I had several pilots underway. And regardless of whether it was cancer patients in a hospital or women in a shelter, people were embracing this idea. And they said it was helping them. People who described themselves as having no creative skills said that they were able to share feelings that had previously been inaccessible and to express what was happening in their lives in very meaningful ways. One of the most important steps along the way was when I met with McLean Hospital. McLean's the top-ranked psychiatric hospital in the country. I was a business person with an idea and some passion, but I had no clinical background, so I really didn't know how this would go. I'll never forget one of our very first experiences at McLean. It was an inpatient psychiatric group. And after the last patient had shared their imagery and all the patients had left the room, the clinical director, he got up and he shut the door and then he sat down at the table across from me. And he said, "Steve, I don't know if you realize this, but that group was very different from what we normally see here." And what he explained was that the level of connection and communication and engagement that happened in the room that day was far beyond what typically happens in talk-based therapy groups. And he said that people with mental illness sometimes have the hardest time expressing what's going on in their lives, and that makes treatment so difficult. And that's why he said that the communication that happened in the room that day was so important. In just over a year, McLean patients and clinicians have now embraced EDI. It's become widely implemented across a variety of therapeutic programs at McLean, and it's expanding rapidly. And as for me, I now find myself leading a nonprofit organization called the EDI Institute, focused on innovating new therapeutic approaches for EDI and for spreading it broadly. Now I'd like to share a couple of examples with you for how expressive digital imagery works. And the first case involves a young man who I'll call Peter. So Peter's in his early 20s, and I met Peter at a treatment center for substance use disorder. So the clinicians warned me that Peter was a little bit of the resistant type. And I have to admit, when I first met Peter, I really wasn't quite sure how he would react to this idea. This was the first image that Peter created. And he titled his image, "The Story of My Addiction." And with tears in his eyes, in a therapeutic group, Peter explained that this one image told the whole story of his addiction. Because you see, this image, it began as a photograph of the front seat of Peter's car. And in that group, he explained that when he was using drugs, every day after work, he would drive in his car to an isolated location, sit in this seat, and in his words, waste the hours away using drugs, getting high, until he knew each evening his parents would be in bed, he'd go home, go to sleep, and repeat the same cycle day after day. And the remarkable thing was that Peter said he hadn't been able to share that story before. He said he was sick of talking about his challenges and that he was hurting and that nothing was ever changing, but that with this image, he was finally able to share what it was he was going through. Peter said he wanted to take this image home with him as an active reminder of the life that he doesn't want to return to. And in the days and weeks following this group, every time I'd see Peter in the halls, he would thank me and he would tell me he was continuing to create imagery in support of his recovery. The next story I'd like to share is from a man who I'll call Jonathan. Jonathan's in his 30s, and I met Jonathan at a community program for adults with lived experience with mental illness. And that's actually Jonathan in this photograph. He had somebody hold an iPad and take a picture of him as he stood with his back to the camera in the front of this auditorium. And then Jonathan took this iPad and he transformed that photograph into his own expressive image. And these are the steps that he went through along the way, until he got to his final image, which he titled, "Alone, No One Cares." This image was a statement of the personal isolation that Jonathan so often feels in life. And the powerful thing that happened in the room that day was how all the other members of the group rallied around Jonathan, because they could connect with Jonathan through this image. They looked at this image and they said, "That's so often how we feel too." And you could just feel the support and the emotion in the room and how meaningful that was to Jonathan. At the end of this program, Jonathan told me that this was one of the most powerful group experiences he had ever been part of. So expressive digital imagery has now become a standard part of programs like the one that Jonathan attended. In this particular 10-week program, participants start with photographs that they have on their devices, and then they use a specialized mobile app that we've developed to transform those photographs into their own expressive images. They do this either at home or they do that in the groups. And then the imagery that they've created now becomes the foundation for the sharing and communication that happens in those groups. And even when the program is over at the end of the 10 weeks, the participants can continue sharing imagery in support of their recoveries. So now you've heard a little bit about how expressive digital imagery works. I'd now like to let you listen to some people who have experienced it themselves.
I think that one of the things that is most difficult living with a mental illness is feeling like you're alone and no one understands you.
Well, sharing the images with my loved ones helps them understand me more so than they already do.
I don't know, I just found that the images were just a different kind of means of expression that seemed to be very poignant.
But it also creates reactions that I hadn't anticipated.
And I found that it was a way in which I could, I would say, express things that I couldn't express verbally.
One of the images that I expressed to my son made him cry, which he never does. So that's how powerful these images can be.
We're talking about tough things, feelings, people feel vulnerable, and the ability to meet on common ground and look at an image and everybody be able to connect to it and to say, wow, I felt that way too.
So this has been a deeply personal journey for me. I now understand how hard it is for us to express ourselves during life's most challenging moments. I felt this myself with my own family, and now I've seen it with so many others as well. But with these first applications of expressive digital imagery, we now have a new technique that can help. And I hope that others will develop new ways of taking this idea to help people communicate and cope. I believe that the possibilities for innovations like expressive digital imagery are unlimited. For people with chronic illnesses, whether it's diabetes or MS or cancer or mental illness. For children who have been victims of trauma. For people in end-of-life hospice care. For veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. All now able to express themselves in entirely new ways and to promote their recoveries and their emotional resilience. And that's what has me so passionate about this idea and for all that lies ahead. Thank you.